So, how much should you be paying the people on your team? This is a question that I see and hear a lot when people are hiring. I see it in Facebook groups. People are asking you, "Oh, how much do you pay your VA?" Or, "I'm thinking of hiring a project manager. How much should I be planning to spend?" And, it's a really important question, especially if you're trying to create a business where you're not just, schlepping things over to people overseas who are making $2, $3 an hour. If you're actually trying to create equitable pay and be using your business as a way of reducing inequity and of closing the wage gap and all of those kind of things that are so important to us as progressive visionary CEOs. So today I want to show you the tool that we use to figure out how much we pay each of our team members, and our clients also use this as well. It's called the Equitable Pay Planner. And really, what it is a way of making sure that we're paying equitably, we're not contributing to creating an increasing wage or wealth gap, and we're paying people in a way that allows us to be profitable while also ensuring that they are well compensated for the work that they're doing. When it comes to figuring out how to pay people, there are a couple of approaches that people usually take. The first approach is that they, pick a number out of the hat, right? It's, just kind of a random number. And, maybe that comes from asking peers, or that comes from going and just doing kind of a quick survey, or looking at various websites to see, Googling what's the average pay for an assistant in, whatever area it happens to be. And when you're just starting your business and you really don't have a context, you don't really know what folks are going to be doing or not doing, it kind of makes sense that that's your approach, right? But as your business grows, it becomes less and less feasible to be able to do this because, when you're just picking numbers randomly, it's really easy to end up overpaying some people while underpaying others. And we end up with a situation where we're stressed out because we're spending so much on our team. And, maybe we're worried that we're not going to be able to make payroll, or we're paying for more than we're getting, or people are leaving, right? Because they can get more money elsewhere, right? So we end up, when we're choosing these random numbers, just with this stress that comes from having arbitrarily paid people an amount that might be an overpay or might be an underpay for what they're actually contributing. Not only that, but every time we go to figure out how much to pay someone, we have to constantly remake the decision, right? So you have to hire someone to do project management. And so you have to go and figure out how much to pay them. And then you want to hire someone to do, some customer service. And so you have to figure out how much to pay them. And then you hire someone to do some admin work, and you have to figure out how much to pay them. And this takes up a lot of mental energy, which, quite frankly, if you're running a business, the fewer decisions that you can have needed to be made fresh all the time, the better, right? Decision fatigue is real, and we don't want you to have to be making these decisions constantly fresh all the time. And then the third thing that happens, and we alluded to this off the top, and it kind of relates to this idea of overpaying and underpaying, but really, when we're just picking numbers and we don't have a system behind it, we end up contributing to the wage gap. And, for some people, they don't care, right? That's not a priority for them. But if you're watching this video and, you've been following any of our stuff for any amount of time, you know that we really want to make sure that we're creating businesses that are good for everyone, all of the stakeholders. And the truth is, if you don't know what constitutes the equivalent results, the equivalent work in your business, you can't compensate equitably based on that. You can't compensate equitably if you don't know what equitable work distribution and equitable compensation looks like in that context. So those are the challenges that happen when we end up paying in this kind of random way. Now, what we want to have instead is kind of the opposite of that, right? We want to have a system for compensation. We want to have a framework, or even a formula that tells us how much to pay people. And we want that formula to do three things for us. Number one, we want it to be profitable, but not just profitable for us. We want it to be profitable for all stakeholders. We want it to be profitable for the people people who are doing the work, right? We want the people who are doing the work to feel as though they are being richly rewarded for what they're what they're bringing to the business. But at the same time, we want them to be able to, not be paid so much that we have nothing left for ourselves or for the business itself. So we want to be profitable in a true stakeholder sense. The other thing that we want to have is we want to have something that doesn't require us to make decisions all the time and thus frees up our energy and our time to be able to focus on the big decisions that need to be made fresh, right? You don't need to be remaking every decision all the time. And what we want to have is your energy and your time freed up so that you can be focusing on the things that matter and that will really move the needle. And then finally, of course, we want to have something that's equitable. We want to have a pay structure that creates the kind of business that you always wanted to work for, where people are paid well, not based on how well they can negotiate, but based on the value that they bring to the business. And so that's what this equitable pay planner is designed to create. And if you want to be able to do this in your business and you don't already have a copy of this, if you're watching this in the Facebook group, go ahead and just comment worksheet below, and we're happy to send a copy of this to you. If you're watching this elsewhere on YouTube, on Medium, you found it somewhere else on the interwebs, there should be a link where you can go ahead and download this directly. So what does actually go into building equitable pay? When we're building an equitable compensation framework or an equitable pay plan, there are 4 key components that we need to think about. The first is, what is our philosophy, right? How do we think, or how do we define equitable in the context of our business? What does it mean to be providing equitable pay? There's a lot of different things that can mean. And we'll go through some of the key questions that you need to ask yourself in a second. The second thing is, once you know what equitable is based on or what equitable means to your business, you need to know how responsibility translates into that equitable compensation. And that's going to be based on the positions that you have in your business. So depending on what someone is doing in your business, what responsibility they own, and what does that mean in terms of what equitable looks like. Then we want to come up with benchmarks. We want to be able to say, if this is your position, how much money are you going to be compensated based on what's equitable, based on what we define equitable to mean? And finally, we want to essentially create a way of having transparent salary where it's like, okay, if this is your position and this is the benchmark, then this is the number that you should be paid, right? So that it's not something that we're just making up as we go along, but it's actually based on a system. It's based on pre-made decisions, and it's based on our definition of what equitable means to us and our business. Now, when it comes to defining your philosophy, we actually need to take a step back and consider that we're not just talking about, how much are we going to pay people in terms purely of money, because compensation actually takes many forms. Now, for the bulk of what we're going through here, yes, we're going to be talking about money. We're going to be talking about pay, in other words. But there are other forms of compensation that come into play when it comes to defining your equitable compensation philosophy. For example, what benefits do you offer? This could be health, dental, other forms of wellness. This could be family leave. It could be paying for people's technology, having technology allowances. One of the coolest ones that I've seen is people who had an unlimited book benefit, right? Any book you wanted, fiction, nonfiction, work related, not related, it didn't matter. The company would buy it for you, right? What kind of benefits you might want to offer also factors into compensation. Then we have the time side of the equation. So how do you compensate people in terms of flexibility of how they're able to work? Do you have fixed work hours? Do you have minimum work hours? What do you do in terms of vacation? What happens if someone needs to take leave? How many hours is considered full-time in your company? That's something that you want to be considering as you're considering what equitable compensation might look like. And then finally, there's this question of resourcing. And ultimately, what resourcing is asking asking us is to consider what happens if we are under-resourced. What happens if we don't have enough people because maybe someone is off or because we need to hire for a position? How do we handle those situations? What's our go-to to make sure that in situations where we're maybe under-resourced, we're still contributing to people's lives in a way that we're not just saying, oh, you can take time off except when we're super busy, or, oh, we need you to work twice as much, but we're not going to pay you more, right? So resourcing is kind of like the control lever in terms of our whole compensation philosophy that needs to come into play here. Now, the really important thing is to realize is that these all impact each other, right? And so you can have a company that, maybe you focus on paying people really well, right? And you go all the way up on paying people really well. But as a trade-off for that, you don't have as much flexibility in terms of the time off or the flexibility of when people work that you're going to need to have from people. Maybe you're going to be able to, at this point in your business, you can't offer a lot of benefits, right? Your business is small, so you compensate by paying people a little better in lieu of formal benefits. And maybe in resourcing, you have kind of an attitude of, we don't want people to have to work a whole ton, but we need people to be willing to pitch in extra, right? So you can have an equitable compensation map that might look something like this. Now, it doesn't have to be scientific or mathematical at this point. But before we get into the details of figuring how much you're going to pay people in monetary form specifically, I want you to think about what makes sense for your business right now, especially when you think about your company's values. So when you think about your company's values, do you express through those values a priority for flexibility and time? In that case, you might want to make sure that this time thing is weighted more heavily. Do you really talk a lot about the importance of family, of connection, of having a life outside of business? In that case, it could be time, it could be benefits that you want to weight more heavily to. Consider how these things are going to play in. And I know you're going to want to be able to put all of these things to the max, right? That's the ideal. And the truth is, when your business is small, you can't max out all of these things. Now, as you're going through this, I want you just to think about, as I said, which of these things would be the highest priority for you and your business based on your values. But the other thing that I want you to consider is that in order for compensation to be equitable, right? That's what we're trying to do here. In order for compensation to be equitable, you can't have different rules for yourself as compared to the rest of your team. Right? Now, I'm not saying that compensation has to be equal across the board, but one of the biggest sources of inequity in terms of compensation is when people in power have a different set of rules that they play by than the people who are not in power. So if you personally want to be able to take time off whenever you want, however much you want, and you're not willing to consider how you can extend a version of that to your team, you are creating inequities in your compensation structure. So this could be in terms of how much you pay yourself. If you want to pay yourself not for the work you're doing in the business, but just based on how much you want to make, then you have to make sure that you're compensating the rest of your team in line with that, right? Benefits, resourcing, all of these things. We need to make sure that you are not putting yourself in a position where the power distance is so high that you get all of these great things, but everyone else only gets small things. Okay, so go ahead and take a few moments and just map out what this might look like for yourself. And then we'll go on to the next step. So as we go to actually figure out, okay, how much am I actually going to pay people? And what is my compensation philosophy when it comes to how much money do we pay people? There are a couple of main categories that we want to think about. The first is, what are we going to base our compensation structure on, right? What is our baseline for compensation? And within this, there are two real questions for you to be answering for yourself. The first question is, how are we going to define what equitable market compensation looks like? Who are we comparing to? What are we basing this off of? Are we going to base it off of what's common in the online business world? Are we going to look at what's common nationally? Are we going to look at this on a local geographic level? If you don't know where to start, we usually say, look at a national level, and you can use a site like payscale.com and say, what is the typical compensation for, usually we go to an admin assistant, right? What's the typical compensation for an admin assistant in the United States or in Canada or in Australia or wherever you happen to be? And for us in our business, because one of the things we want to do is make sure that we're paying people well, that's part of our underlying philosophy, is we actually say not what's the average, not what's the median, but what is actually that 80th percentile? And sites like payscale.com can help you figure that out. But once what you're going to baseline on, you don't need to go and necessarily do that research right now. You can do that later. For now, just figure out what are you going to choose as the market that you're comparing to. Within this is also the idea of a living wage, right? So if you're going to be aiming to pay a living wage, the question is, living wage for where or for whom? And you want to be thinking about those questions and answering them for yourself. The second thing that you want to baseline is you want to baseline what is considered full-time in your business. Is full-time 40 hours a week? Is it 35 hours a week? Is it 25 hours a week? You can choose to set the definition of what full-time means in your business. So what is a full-time equivalent job? Is it someone who works 30 to 35 hours a week? That's what it is in our business. Or is what you consider full-time to be only 20 hours a week because that's what you feel like you can contribute full-time. And in order to make the opportunity equitable for everyone on your team, you're going to pay full-time dollars, right? A full-time salary for only 20 hours of work. Is that what you want? Right? So think about that. If you were going to pay someone a full-time salary, how many hours would they be expected to work in your company? That's the baseline side of things. That's just kind of establishing your underlying assumptions, right, about how people are going to be compensated. Then what we want to do is we want to be able to adjust those baselines based on factors that may be relevant to, the world, so to speak. And there are two main adjustments here that you're going to want to be dealing with. The first is the cost of living adjustment. And there's a lot of different ways people define cost of living adjustments. Really, what we're talking about here is the impact of inflation. So are you going to give people an automatic raise every year to make sure that your pay structure is keeping up with inflation? That's basically what that means, right? And if so, how are you going to figure that out? Are you going to go based on whatever the government says, whatever percent the government says? Are you going to go and do a historical average? What are you going to do to define what your annual increase is going to be year over year if you decide to do that? Now, I will note that if you want to be paying people well, you have to make sure that salaries are keeping up with inflation, because the last thing you want is to be paying someone, I'll just pick a round number of a hat, $20 an hour, and then 2 years later, inflation has happened. You can't find anyone for $20 an hour. So now you hire someone else to do that same job, but you're going to pay them $21 an hour. So now you have someone making $21 an hour and someone making $20 an hour for the exact same job in the exact same role. That's not going to lead to an equitable path forward. Whereas if you build inflation calculations into the way that you think about salary and the way you think about compensation, that wouldn't be an issue. So how are you going to handle inflation? The easiest thing to do is usually just to take a historical average and say 3% per year. That's usually the benchmark rate for most countries. I think in the G7, at least, they try and aim for 3% per year. Some years it's higher, some years it's lower, but mathematically it's a little simpler. You can also go based on whatever the reported annual inflation rate is. It's completely your call. And then the final one is location. And this is a question of, are you going to pay people differently depending on where you choose to live or where they choose to live? Now, there's a lot of different ways that you can go about this, right? You can say, no, regardless of location, everyone's going to get paid the same amount so that people can have the freedom to move where they want and not feel as though they would lose money if they moved somewhere else, right? It kind of can be a weird conversation if someone moves from a high cost of living area to a low cost of living area, and you're like, well, I have to reduce your pay because that's how our formula works, right? That can be an awkward conversation. At the same time, if you know that you're looking for people who are in a very competitive market, then maybe you want to be able to, bring in some location stuff. Maybe you want to have, if you live in a big city, you get this much more. If you live in a medium size or small city, you get this much. And if you live in a small town or rural, then you get, this much, right? There's, again, all of these different variables. You have to decide ahead of time what makes sense, right? Are you going to pay more based on where someone lives in the world? Right? Or are you going to pay less? This is especially important. This is supposed to be the world, by the way. I don't know if you can tell. This is the Americas. Anyway, doesn't matter. This is especially important, though, if you're thinking about hiring people from overseas. Are you going to pay them a living wage based on where they live, or are you going to pay everyone the same, regardless of where they live and work? Again, you want to look at your values here. Your values should be the thing that inform your answers to all of these questions. Once you've got your questions and your answers sorted out, we want to be able to write down a simple compensation philosophy statement, right? Just 2 or 3 sentences where you're going to capture all of this information, as well as that kind of overall comp mix, into a simple statement. So it could be, at our company, we really believe that time is the most important resource that we have. As such, we choose to provide minimum vacation times and flexible work hours while paying people based on the US average for their position, keeping up with inflation. A full-time work week in our company is only 30 hours a week, and you're paid the same regardless of where you work in the world. Like, that's not a very eloquent sounding compensation philosophy. You can definitely wordsmith it, but that's the idea of where we want to get to. Once you know the answers to your compensation philosophy questions, then you can go ahead and actually start turning that into a plan for how you're going to pay people. And this is where we talk about the different types of responsibilities that people have and how we're going to compensate people based on what those responsibilities are. So if you have done the billion-dollar team exercise, if you've gone and actually written proper job descriptions for people, you will have already done a lot of work in terms of figuring out what is the responsibility that people have, depending on what they're doing for the business. And what we want to do is we want to be able to say, depending on those levels of contribution, how much are we going to pay people? And really what this comes down to, we recommend using a level system. And there's an article from Buffer that we kind of borrowed and adapted this from. But we essentially say, depending on how much responsibility you have in the business, you're going to be compensated differently. So if you're at a helper level, if you're at an intern level, I'm just going to pick numbers out of a hat here. I'm not saying use these numbers, but you might say that if you're an intern or a helper level, you're going to start at $30K a year. If you're entry level, you're going to start at $40K. An intermediate might be $55K. A specialist might be $65K. A strategist might be, I don't know, my numbers are really getting out of whack here. Oh, probably not that high. Let's say $80K for a strategist and $100K for a principal or a senior implementer. And then you want to say, does that change if someone is an individual contributor, if they're just doing the work, versus if they're actually responsible for managing others? In our business, and what we recommend is that you don't just differentiate, right? If someone is a supervisor, they make the same amount as a specialist. If someone is a manager, they make the same amount as a strategist. If someone is a director, they make the same amount as a principal. And then what are you going to have your executive pay start at? Now, again, how you fill in these numbers is going to depend on what you came up with in terms of your benchmarks and the way that you figure out, what are you basing this on? What are your baselines on? What is considered full-time? But you want to be able to fill this in for your company so that you know what are the different starting rates for each of the positions that you have. Then once you've got that, you go through and you figure out, who have we got on our team and what kind of jobs and positions do we have in our business, and what level are they at? For this, we recommend going all the way back to your $1 billion team and figuring out if these are the jobs we're going to have in the future, what level will they be at? So you'll have a CEO, and that's going to be at level 7, which was that executive level. You'll have a COO, which might be level 7, and so on and so forth. Maybe you'll have a director of marketing, and a director level position, you might decide that's level 6. And then maybe you'll have a team lead, right? Like a team lead for a sales team, and that might be level 4, right? And so you're going to fill this out for all of the different positions that you came up with that you might have someday in your business. And same thing on the individual contributor side, right? You might have an admin assistant, and you decide that that's going to be an entry level position in your business. You might have a marketing strategist, which was whatever I said the strategist level was. I think I said that was level 6. What level is a copywriter? Right? Is a copywriter an intermediate position, in which case it'd be a 3? Is it a little bit more senior than that, in which case it'd be a 4? Do you have junior copywriters and do you have senior copywriters, right? And you want to go through and just figure out what levels these are at. Because at the end of the day, the way you're going to figure out how much to compensate people is based on the roles that they fill. Right? So that's the last step here, is that you go and you say, who have we got? So this might be Brianne. And you might say that based on what is actually happening in the business right now, Brianne's primary job is at the managing, that's not spelled right, but you get the idea. Managing director. That's my primary job. That's my main job title, but I only spend 20% of my time there. Most of my time, I actually spend it doing as a subject matter expert, which we defined as a specialist level. And I spend 80% of my time doing that. And so what that means is that whatever level I took as managing director was a level 6 position. And I said that level 6 positions in our company get compensated at $100K. And if 20% of my time is on that, then I'm going to pay $20K for the work I'm doing as the managing director. And if the specialist role, I'm going to not use the numbers I used before. I'm going to use really round numbers because that's going to be simpler. But that was a level 5. And if I said that a level 5 position made $80K a year, and I'm spending 80% of my time doing that, then I should be making, if my quick mental math here is right, $64,000 based on my work as a specialist. I hope that's right. 8 times 8 is 64. So my math should be right, which means that my total comp here should be $84,000 a year, assuming that I'm working full time. If I'm not working full time, if I'm only working 20 hours a week and full time at our business was 40 hours a week, then I should be making 42. And you go through each of the people in your business and you figure out what is their primary role from that chart. How much percentage of their time are they spending doing it? What is our secondary role? How much percentage of time are we spending doing it? And what does that tell us about how much someone should be compensated? Now, you can have a fancy spreadsheet, and our clients have a fancy spreadsheet. You can fill in the spreadsheet and you can just put in all the numbers and it comes out and it pops out what the number is. But this is the thinking process that you have to go through if you want to create equitable compensation in your company. Now, there's one last thing I want to say about this before I close this video off, which is to say that there are some companies whose compensation philosophy is to say everyone gets paid the same amount regardless of what they're doing in the business. And that is totally a valid way of thinking about compensation. And you have to just really be considering, for where your business is right now, can you afford to pay everyone at the same level as you want and need and deserve to be compensated? And so that's just something I want to put in there as a consideration. We also haven't talked about things like, profit sharing or bonusing or those kind of things. That's a different conversation. But right now, we just want to focus on what does equitable compensation look like when we're looking at foundational salary, when we're talking about how much people are being paid for the work that they're doing in the business. And so if you are thinking and you're trying to figure out how much do I pay people, if you're trying to decide what does this even look like, I hope that this has been helpful, because at the end of the day, you want to create this situation where you're able to pay people equitably, you're able to be profitable, and you don't need to make these decisions over and over every single time. So if that's what you want to be able to do, I think the Equitable Pay Planner, honestly, I've never seen anyone else out there have anything like it. So I highly recommend that you give it a go. And if you want a copy of it, again, you can just go ahead. If you're in the Facebook group, comment worksheet. We're happy to send it to you. If you're anywhere else on the interwebs, there should be a link below where you can go ahead and download it and start playing with it yourself. So I hope you found this helpful. And please let us know what you came up with as you worked through the Equitable Pay Planner. We'll talk to you again. Bye-bye.